came from two trends that we've been seeing in journalism. One is the importance of audio across all media, even for journalism outlets that come from a TV background, that come from a text background. And the other is the growing importance of subscriptions in terms of funding journalism and being able to keep an audience engaged and get an audience to value the journalism, to pay for it. Audio is proving to be quite good at retaining subscribers. It gives you more chances to engage with your audience. They can't necessarily read your article or watch your video while they are driving, exercising, or things like that, but they can engage with a podcast. People tend to connect with the hosts, which is good. And it's also, audio can be a place where you can highlight a pretty broad range of the journalism that you're doing and be able to, help people know what's worth paying for, what they have, what they're doing. So we'll explore all of this with the panel. We're going to use the word subscriber quite broadly. So it's not necessarily only paywall. It can be nonprofit, for-profit, really, you could say donor, member, supporter, any things across all the various languages spoken here, but essentially anyone who's valuing the journalism, paying for it. And this is an editorial conversation, not so much a business model one, but by design, there are some different business models on stage, so hopefully everyone can connect with something there and take away something to enhance their journalism when they get back to work. We'll do a quick intro of the panel and then just ask each of them to start by giving us a big picture sense of what they're doing with audio and where it connects to the subscription businesses. So we have Nicole Jackson, head of audio at The Guardian, Cheryl Brumley, head of audio at the Financial Times, and Nishat Kurwa, who is SVP and executive producer at the Vox Media Podcast Network, which includes Vox, of course, but also New York Magazine, The Verge, many others. Maybe let's start with Nishat, just that broader question of what you're doing with audio and how it connects with your subscription business.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. Whoops. Unmute like that. Thanks to you all for being here. And so the Vox Media Podcast Network is a top 10 podcast network in the US. And under our network are a number of different podcasts across categories, so almost every category topically. And then many different formats. So we have a news podcast, Today Explained, that comes out of our news site, Vox.com. We have talk shows like Pivot with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway and On with Kara Swisher. We have narrative shows like Criminal, so one of the first true crime podcasts. And many of those shows, and our network is a mix of shows that we sell and distribute for partners, as well as many shows that come from within our company, which is a broad media company that has a number of editorial brands, some of which I mentioned, some of which Mark mentioned. And so many of our shows are produced, are homegrown and produced as well as sold and distributed by us. And then in terms of subscriptions, podcast subscriptions-wise, we have a couple of models that are, sorry, I was like, is that my own feedback? And it is not. So we have a couple of podcast subscription models. One is Cafe, is a podcast shop that Vox Media acquired a few years ago, and their leading show is Stay Tuned with Preet Bharara. And there is a component of their show, they have a subscription product called Cafe Insider. If you're a subscriber, you can get some content that includes a podcast briefing as well as notes from their contributors. So it's a mix of podcast and text material behind the paywall. And then we also have a subscription tier for Criminal that we just launched. But then outside of podcasts, at our editorial brands, New York Magazine is probably the one with the most developed subscription product. And they're, like many other magazines and publications, subscribers get unlimited access to New York Magazine text material. And we do have there are ways that podcasts feed into that, and I think we'll get more into that as we go forward in the panel.
Okay, Cheryl, same question. Big picture, what you're doing at the Financial Times with audio and how it connects to the larger subscription program that the entity has.
Yes, thank you. Really nice to be here. So for those who don't know, the Financial Times is a business paper based out of the UK, but truly international. And we we often say premium when we talk about the Financial Times subscription. That means because premium is sort of a word for very expensive. But our podcasts are free. We don't have any yet behind the paywall. That isn't to say that we might put a few behind the paywall in the future. But right now, all of our podcasts are free. They're top of funnel. The goal, since I arrived at the Financial Times in 2019, was to really sort of exponentially grow the number of listeners and people who actually interact with our journalism through audio exponentially. So being a free product allows us to do that. There are also sort of commercial upsides to being free. But at the moment, yes, we don't have any subscription behind the paywall podcast. We're very rigorous on audience need and identifying sort of gaps and niches within the market. We have 12 shows, and that ranges from our daily podcast. It's a sort of daily FT news briefing, which is about anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes every day, and it's sort of short, sharp, and punchy, to more niche podcasts that sort of bring listeners in who are interested in a part of the FT and not just everything that we have to offer. And so we have a foreign policy podcast, a personal finance podcast. We have 2 narrative strands. So those are limited run narrative series. We have a tech podcast. So it really runs the gamut of our reporting at the FT.
And Nicole, The Guardian.
Hi, it's really nice to be here. So The Guardian's been making podcasts for almost 20 years. None of them are behind a paywall. We've always given out our podcasts for free. In fact, to be honest, all Guardian content is free. We've recently introduced a sort of charge if you go beyond a certain number of articles on the app. But, you know, in theory, you can just still go to the website and read everything for free. And I think there have been sort of 2 big moments for me in podcasting for The Guardian. One was in 2018 when, along with a team, I launched this show called Today in Focus. It was a daily news podcast. Remarkably, at the time, there wasn't actually very much kind of like that in the UK, which seems wild because now it's an incredibly saturated market. But I think that was really important because it meant we could get a real foothold and become a market leader in daily news podcasting. And that just allowed us to reach this enormous audience. And we had kind of various goals in mind. I knew that we wanted to reach a global audience. We're a global news organization, and so we always kind of wanted to make our content very global facing. That's really paid off for us. Over 50% of our audience are now outside the UK. And then the second thing was to try and reach as wide an audience as possible. So we weren't going after a younger audience, but I think by just making really good content, we've been able to reach a young audience. And so the majority of our audience are 18 to 34. And off the back of the success of Today in Focus, and we already had a kind of portfolio of some other shows, including Football Weekly, which was also a world leader, we were then able to pivot and increase our portfolio. We do politics, science, lifestyle. And then I think the other big turning point for us, it was in 2022 when we then went into narrative series. And so we released something called Can I Tell You a Secret, which was a 6-part narrative about cyber stalking. And the reason I mention that is because, it was kind of, we are always thinking about innovating and diversifying the type of stories that we tell and how we tell them. I think that's really important. So this idea of not just retaining subscribers, listeners, whatever you want to call them, but also always trying to add on to that audience base. And that then got bought by Netflix, and it got turned into a 2-part series, which went out this year. And what was amazing is we saw this huge sort of bounce back to the podcast feed. So even though that show was 2 years old, it got this whole new audience. So I think we think not just about podcasts. And then finally, I would say we've launched a show called, narrative series called Black Box, which is about artificial intelligence. And that's, again, a big narrative series, been a big hit. And the reason I mentioned that is because we put the first episode out in all of our other feeds. And so I think that has been a really important strategy for us of, like, making clear how much we can kind of cross-promote within our own podcast. And so it's almost like once you've got that one big hit, you can then grow off the back of that.
And maybe let's stay with Nicole, because you've talked a little bit about this, and everyone on stage has some unique version of a daily news podcast, but then there are also other offerings that go deeper into sports, into culture, long-form interviews. Can you talk a little bit, Nicole, about the value of going deeper on particular topics, and in terms of how that maybe can keep subscribers engaged and keep them excited about the journalism?
Yeah, I think Black Box is a really good example of that. So it's about artificial intelligence, but it is not a tech podcast. I sort of cannot say that more strongly, because I feel like there are loads of really great tech podcasts around. If you want to know about AI in that sense, then you should go to them. But I felt like I still didn't really understand what artificial intelligence was. I didn't understand how it was already in our lives and how it was going to kind of impact our lives going forward. And so we set out to make this series. And the most important thing we all felt from the beginning was putting human storytelling at the sort of center of that. So understanding AI through human stories. And I guess the sort of thing that I think The Guardian is in a kind of very sort of lucky position to be able to do is that we were able to invest really heavily in staffing it properly, sound design, story structure, kind of re-edits, and sort of really, really crafting something so that by the time we sort of put out this 7-part series, we felt that we had sort of really kind of done it to the best of our ability. And yeah, I think it's really important that we sort of have the time to be able to tell these stories properly. And we really found the audience engaged with that. It was really amazing. I'm sure that putting out that first episode across all of the other feeds really helped. But obviously the test is then, will that audience stay with you once that sort of second episode goes up? And what we saw really gratifyingly was that just growth of every single episode.
And Nishat, maybe to kind of stay with that theme, because there, I'm sure, are people in the audience that doing a daily news podcast would be a pretty heavy lift, but doing something weekly or monthly or something that's evergreen is a possibility. Can you talk a little bit, too, about how to go beyond the daily news and develop podcasts around journalism that are on other topics, going deeper in that sense?
Yeah, sure. So many of when I first came to Vox Media, their podcast network didn't exist. There were a couple of our editorial brands where the editors-in-chief were experimenting with podcasts, and those podcasts were mostly talk shows. The Verge actually has our longest-standing podcast called The Vergecast, and that was a talk show between 3 of their top editors. It predates the podcast network. They always like to remind me. And it's a great show, and they have a very loyal and dedicated fan base. And at the time, these editors, so it was Nilay Patel and other editors at The Verge, Kara Swisher at Recode, which the company had acquired, and Ezra Klein at Vox.com. And they, I think, as editors-in-chief, wanted that direct connection to their audiences, and they also saw the promise of podcasting. And we were starting to see success with those 3 shows, and that's when I came in to kind of build an infrastructure and bring some best practices from my career in audio and public radio. And so I think in following those editors-in-chief into podcasting, as Mark said, those shows started out as once-a-week shows that the editors were doing as part of their sort of global editor-at-large, editor-in-chief jobs. And they were devoting a lot of, part of the reason the company started to take this seriously as a business was the heads of these organizations, of these brands, were spending quite a lot of time on podcasting each week. That being said, it was a once-a-week show. And, each one was highly topical. It brought in topics from their newsroom or their newsroom's coverage, but wasn't sort of based on their newsroom's coverage. And it really carved out the model of the editors as the subject matter experts. And that actually has been the foundation of our network. In shows in every category, we really bring audiences authoritative, credible subject matter experts at the helm of these shows. At this point, not all our shows are journalism-based. Many of them are journalism-based, if not journalism-adjacent. And then as we've grown the network, we've also partnered with third parties, so outside partners who already had established shows, but again, have that same synergy with our network, are highly credible, are experts in their field. And so, often with the shows that are homegrown, they've started as once a week, and as our business gained momentum and really it became clear that podcasting was going to be a strong business for us, we would take these shows that had already accumulated this big audience and then double the show to twice a week. Obviously, that doubles your advertising inventory, but it also importantly strengthens the relationship of the audience to the show. And that, just in talking about subscriptions, that to me is why podcasts are just an incredible asset in terms of brand equity and sort of delivering to your paid supporters, because we know already that podcasts are habit forming. So people spend a lot of time with them. And so when you talk about the shows that we do even once a week, we do have a daily news show called Today Explain out of Vox.com. That's our only daily show, but even with our once weekly shows, people are spending an hour with those hosts each week, and they're coming usually to a show to get their fix on whatever that topic is. For the Vergecast, when people want to understand all of the tech that is coursing through their lives, they come to those 3 editors to understand new technology features, what's released, and to have like a good hang with these people that they really trust. So the habit-forming aspect of any podcast is really important, I think, in terms of keeping subscribers feeling like they are getting a lot of value for the time that they spend with your brand. And then additionally, the cliche that the podcasting always talks about, but is true, is the intimacy. So, people are spending that time. The hosts are in your ears. It's as all of you who are podcast listeners probably know, you're taking them into all of the kind of intimate spaces in your life, and that relationship strengthens not only the brand loyalty, sort of the brand of the podcast, but by extension, loyalty to your brand at large, but also I think listeners are more inclined, because of that relationship, to want to contribute potentially if they know that their contribution is being poured directly into this thing that they have such a close and intimate relationship with. And a lot of podcast relationships, even with news producers, editors, reporters, are parasocial relationships. So it is this intimate relationship that feels like somebody I have in my life delivering me this essential news on, and information that I need every week. That's a very digestible, accessible mode of receiving that information, and often they're my friend. And so I do think that podcasts, more so maybe than some other formats, have this habit and bond-forming potential that then can very much be leveraged for paid support.
Funny story on the back of that. I have a couple of my personal friends are really big fans of our markets chat show, which is called Unhedged. And one of the hosts flew from New York to London, spent a week at our London bureau, and I told one of my friends who does not work at the FT, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me? I could have invited him for dinner." Yes. And I said, "But you don't really know him. Do you really?"
All the time we get letters into Pivot Weekly with people who are like, "I know this is a long shot, but Kara, Scott, if you're ever in such and such city, I'd love to take you out for a drink. Please come to dinner."
They're very busy.
I don't know how often that's successful, but
yeah. But just off of the back of what everyone's saying here, we also have a daily, and it is very powerful for sort of building these habits, as Nishat was saying. That's very powerful for a brand. Our daily news briefing, which comes out every Monday through Friday, and which most people listen to on their morning commutes, when we looked into the survey data around it, most people were listening before 9 a.m. on their commutes, and so the FT was presumably the first thing they were interacting with that morning, which is a very sort of powerful thing. That said, dailies are very expensive to do. They're very time intensive, and we can't do 12 of them. So we have other shows, which really we sort of think about that as helping us build sort of new audiences, reach hard to reach audiences. I mean, for the FT, for us, that is younger audiences. And audio has been very sort of successful at bringing in younger people into the sort of FT sphere. About a quarter of our listeners are under 35. And Also women, we try to reach through different sort of strands and sort of verticals within the FT. So we have a working careers podcast called Working It. We find that predominantly the people who listen are women. The host is a woman, not by accident. And similarly with our Life and Art podcast, which we've also doubled the content for that to kind of open up ad revenue, but also to try and develop a habit around that show a little bit more than with just a show that runs once a week. That show brings in a lot more women proportionally than some of our other shows. So we think about the FT as sort of amalgam of not just business reporting, but we have very well-known a weekend brand, and it allows us to kind of drive deeper into different sort of audience spaces. And for the FT particularly, a big growth area for us generally is the US, which also happens to be the biggest sort of audio market. So audio is really seen within the newsroom as something which helps us reach US audiences, builds habits around the brand, and allows us to bring FT journalism in front of these audiences who may not be familiar with the FT nor use it every day.
We've touched a little bit on kind of fitting into people's routine, helping them form a habit. One question that seems to come up a lot when organizations are thinking about doing a podcast is how long should it be? So maybe Cheryl, if you can talk a little bit about how do you balance trying to find something that is short enough to fit into people's routines, fit into their lives, but also long enough to say what you want to say journalistically.
Yeah, and I'm sort of agnostic about length. I personally listen to things that are quite long, about an hour, hour and 10 minutes, and I'm surprised at the end that I'd made it all the way through. But I think that's what's really powerful about audio. And I said on a panel yesterday that it really is the only medium that I can think of where people have a higher tolerance for longer content, which is very powerful in this world where everything is just sound bites and sort of TikTok videos. But we don't have hour-long podcasts at the Financial Times. The longest podcast that we do have is probably our foreign policy show, which kind of is conversations between our very well-known columnist around foreign policy and different policymakers. And that runs about 30 minutes in length. That's enough time to let kind of conversations breathe and unfurl, but still feel kind of compact for commutes. And I think because a lot of FT podcasts, though I do find them entertaining myself, a lot of people come to us for this sort of information or the takeaways or to understand more about, what's going on in the Middle East or, why oil is priced at $90 a barrel, that sort of thing. So they're really an audience sort of focused on takeaways. They're busy. When we do surveys, we do find that commutes and dog walks are predominantly when people listen to us. So we understand our kind of customer in our way, and they are sort of mainly, on the whole, finance professionals, so very busy people who have these sort of interstitial moments to kind of dip into a podcast. So that's sort of informed the length, although I do think with podcasts, depending on your audience, you can go longer.
Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit about how you think about length at the Guardian in the context of keeping the subscribers engaged?
Yes. I mean, I think the pleasure of podcasting, unlike radio, is that you don't have to adhere to any length. So like Cheryl, I don't have this kind of hard and fast rule that a Today in Focus episode must be, say, 25 minutes. However, I think people are really busy. I think it's a really saturated market, and I think we really have to earn people's attention time. And so I feel sometimes, you listen to a first edit and it's sort of 37 minutes, and it doesn't need to be. It can be sort of 27. It's just that we're sort of trying to cram too much in. And sort of to your point about the takeaway, I feel, people quite often, even if they're listening very intently, will sort of come away with sort of 2 or 3 points. And so I always think at the beginning, what is the point we're trying to make? How are we getting there? And have we landed it at the end? And sort of, have we done that as succinctly as possible? And sometimes that will be in 37 minutes, but it just has to you have to sort of really earn that. And I also think listening habits sort of can really impact length. So to Cheryl's point that Today in Focus is a daily, it's listened when you're kind of on the move, sort of, hands and eyes are busy, you're probably doing something else and you just want to sort of have something in your ears. Whereas maybe something like Black Box, which is a kind of premium listen, you might save up all those episodes to listen to in one go. And I think sometimes have a bit more leeway with the sort of length of time, and also obviously those episodes you've been working on for kind of months, sometimes years, there's a lot to try and put in there. So I sort of think you can get away sometimes with slightly longer episode lengths on those kind of series.
Nishat, you want to talk a little bit about length and how you think about that across Vox Media?
Sure. I agree with both of you. It should be as long as it needs to be. That being said, our daily news podcast tends to be, Today Explained, tends to be under a half hour tighter because it also does go on many local radio stations across the country. They do a slightly truncated version for those stations, but they keep it very tight, so it's usually around 20 minutes. And then most of our talk shows are between 45 minutes to an hour, and some, like the Vergecast again, that sort of the Uber talk show rather, exceeds that often. So it has gone up to 1.5, 2 hours. So for the ones that are talk shows and are not sort of tightly edited narratives, they tend to go quite long. And then we have a narrative show from my team called Land of the Giants about technology, and we tend to keep those. They're more documentary stories, and that length is around 45 minutes. I think consistency is important. So if somebody has habituated around a show and it's their go-to news, tech, whatever show, just that knowing that it's generally going to be about the same length, I think helps people stay with you and keep you in that day part that they usually listen, or that commute that they usually listen in. So the consistency is helpful. But I guess the one counterintuitive thing that I would say is, for some of our most popular shows, and in general, our model is to think of those shows as potentially as franchises. So they may start in podcast, but we also, we do live shows like others on the panel do. We also, like many podcasters are expanding into video, and then we also have some podcast subscription products. And so for shows that where listeners are already spending a lot of the time with the host, we are often struck by how much more time they are willing to spend. So, for Criminal, we added for subscribers a kind of behind-the-scenes episode where the co-founders of Criminal, the creators, Phoebe Judge, the host, and Lauren Sporer, basically talk shop in that extra episode. And those can run pretty long, and the listening duration is long for those. It's as long as a regular Criminal episode in the sense people are listening all the way through. And we have, Esther Perel's Where Should We Begin? She just is on a live tour currently around the U.S., and these are like sold out crowds. Now, she, obviously has an exceptional footprint across many media, and that predated her podcasting. But I cite that just to say, when it is a show that people have this deep attachment to, we find often they are hungry for more. And that more can come, it's not perhaps on a regular basis, but they will, they'll ask you for more shows, and that can be bonus episodes occasionally. I think we try to avoid doing too much bonus content because it starts to actually have an impact on the feed. But by and large, I think consistency is important, but also there is a high tolerance for extra content when people are really into a show.
And actually, Cheryl, maybe you can pick up on one of the themes Nishat is talking about there in terms of when you have a hit, something that's really engaging well with your audience, how do you leverage that in terms of getting people excited about the journalism elsewhere, other audio products, coming back to the rest of the FT's journalism? How do you, any best practices there as far as the way people can think about how to make the most out of that when they're already really getting a good audience there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I sort of benefit from, in this way that Nishat and Nicole do, from having a network. So when you have a podcast which is really successful, I see that as a huge advantage. One, you can launch other things on that feed, whether that's just a promo for a new podcast, which draws people deeper sort of into the FT universe, because then not only they're consuming that one podcast, they're consuming another, but also because you can experiment a lot on that feed. And so just for example, on our daily feed, we have a US election Saturday show, which was very high risk to kind of put out in this moment, in this highly sort of saturated US elections moment, on its own feed, but very low risk to put it out on an existing feed where we know that we would least get maybe at least half the audience. We have gone beyond that, which is fantastic. So there's ways to leverage it which benefit yourself editorially and your company editorially. But commercially, there's other ways in which you can kind of make those links back to the subscribers. So we draw people deeper into the FT universe by reading out sort of 50% off subscription offers onto our daily show, but also our show like Life and Art, which is arts and culture, which we find, even though it has a smaller audience than our daily, they're a very committed audience. And these people will listen to the end of an episode or read something out on what we call the post rolls at the very end of the episode with a subscription offer, and they are motivated, because it's very sort of high friction, but they're motivated to kind of put that URL into their computer and then draw deeper into the funnel with these sort of 50% off offers. We also have lower barrier to entry offers for non-subscribers, which is, we have an app that's much cheaper than subscribing to the FT. It's called the FT Edit, and it gives you 8 articles a day from the FT curated by editors. So we think of some other shows as, for instance, our narrative shows, which reach quite a wide audience. I haven't actually talked about our narrative strand, Hot Money, but my goal was to create a strand that was sort of more pop on the pop end, but to show people that really money and money trails are in everything. So our first season, we actually looked at the world of pornography and who actually runs it, who are the kind of shadowy men who run the world of pornography. The next season was about drugs. So this brings in quite a wide audience into the FT, probably people who won't be motivated enough to pay hundreds of dollars immediately for a year's subscription, but we read out offers for our FT Edit app, which is just initially $1 a month. So there are different sort of ways in which we can kind of draw people deeper into the funnel, and different verticals which are sort of lower barrier to entry, but we've had some success with that, so that's been really great.
Nicole, what about at The Guardian in terms of how you take your biggest properties, your best podcasts, and get them to promote the rest of The Guardian's journalism?
Yeah, I think probably actually the best example of that is Football Weekly. So that's one of our longest standing shows, and Max and Barry, the hosts, have this extraordinary relationship with their audience. And I think we, The Guardian, have started to think less now about kind of Guardian podcasts and more the podcasts themselves as their own brands. And so, for example, with Football Weekly, it's giving Football Weekly its own social channels, which lots of other podcasts are doing. That seems like a very obvious thing to do. But I think traditionally, because The Guardian is such a huge brand, we've just kept everything under that kind of one umbrella. But actually sort of allowing them that deeper connection with their listeners through Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, thinking about how they can engage with them, but then also not just thinking about the podcast. Like, podcasts traditionally used to literally be, I think, just a sort of audio product uploaded. And now I think of it as it's also video. It's thinking about how we kind of use video moments on social to draw audiences in. Also, I think merchandise. So the Football Weekly team went on a live tour last year. They did, I think, 12 dates, pretty much sold out everywhere. It was a kind of incredible atmosphere. We sold merchandise at these live tours. And then they wrote a book, which did incredibly well. So it's about thinking about kind of how you build the brand around just that sort of core audio product and not just only thinking about the audio product.
And Nishat, I mean, audio can bring new people into the tent, potential subscribers. It can also engage the existing subscribers. Is there anything, though, that you've found in particular that works especially well when people are trying to think about, hey, we have these paid subscribers that we already have. How do we use audio to keep them engaged, keep them in the tent?
Yeah, I can tell you all about one model that so at New York Magazine, which does have a subscription product, and several podcasts that are affiliated with it, one thing that we've done is to repurpose podcast transcripts. So many subscribers to New York Magazine may not also be subscribers to affiliated podcasts, or maybe have less awareness of some of the podcasts. And so for some of them, the place that they are encountering podcast content is actually through print digital transcripts. And so the way that flow works is the transcript is lightly edited and posted in full to New York Magazine's website. And then it's promoted via their Instagram account. And so a subscriber may come in through a catchy headline or whatever the topic of the episode is. They click through to the site via Instagram, and then if they are not a subscriber, they may hit a paywall. And so in that way, generating site material via the podcast creates a really nice synergy and brings new listeners into the podcast, yes, but also brings new readership to New York Magazine's site via podcast content. So that's been a relationship that has been great, and we're in continuing to strengthen. And then I just think the potential more generally for podcast material to become newsroom material that is published in other formats is really strong. At Today Explained, they just very recently started a newsletter called Today Explained, and it is a totally separate team. So it's not. They weren't added on to the podcast team. The podcast team, produces their show, and they do actually pull a lot from the newsroom. Of course, they sort of work in a very integrated way, so they're all attending the same editorial meetings when they're a big series coming out. The Today Explained team is aware of it, and they interview reporters from their own newsroom, but they also interview reporters from across the public radio system and across print, wherever the best story is. But with the newsletter is often the same topic as the episode of the show that day, but it provides deeper or differentiated coverage from the show. So the branding is the same. There are audiences that are reading and consuming both. They're not getting exactly the same material, but it is a way to deepen their understanding and absorption of the show that is on Today Explained. And I think there are lots of great examples of that, of ways that material can be repurposed, but I've been in many newsrooms myself where there is an assumption that this huge quantity of podcast content can just be sliced and diced up, and I think that it really bears close attention and format expertise, and actually I think it's quite disincentivizing to audiences to delve deeper into the world of a podcast or into your brand if the content is sloppily repurposed and not done with the aesthetics and standards of the particular format in mind. So, I know a lot of us are probably turning to AI tools to sometimes repurpose that content, and that it feels like a very efficient shortcut. And I think just the cautionary note there is that, you need somebody involved who knows the format that you're taking the material into and knows what works best for audiences and is taking a really careful eye to that material. And so if podcast content is going to be repurposed, it just has to be done with the new format.
And Nicole, do you want to maybe pick up on what Nishat's talking about in terms of collaboration with your other colleagues at The Guardian between audio and newsletters and social and video and text and the entire report? What opportunities are there that people can do so that they're kind of maximizing audio, but then also working well with their colleagues and helping each other?
Yeah, I think of our podcast as I think, to be honest, for a lot of people, they're a gateway into the rest of Guardian journalism, not the other way around. And I think a really good example of that is when we work on investigations. So obviously we're world renowned for Guardian investigations, not the podcast as in the Guardian as a whole. But, they can be on incredibly complex subjects, often data-driven, which I can find sometimes incomprehensible, not the writing, but just trying to kind of understand the ins and the outs. And also, quite often not humans at the center of the story. And so I think a big thing for us has been trying to take these kind of big headline stories and then translating them into a really accessible way for listeners. And what we've noticed is they will then, so quite often we will publish stories. We'll do the podcast a couple of days later, and people will say, I was waiting for the podcast. And then I listened to the podcast. Quite often we'll do them as a mini-series as well. We did a brilliant 5-part series called Pegasus, about phone hacking software, Cost of the Crown, another one, which was an investigation into the royal family. And they'll listen to that series, and then they'll go back and they'll read all of the kind of stuff around The Guardian. So I think colleagues have found it really helpful because they feel like it brings their journalism to an entirely new audience. And then in terms of sort of cross-promotion, I think that is actually something that we need to kind of get better at The Guardian. It's a huge organisation. You know, we try to be across as many desks as possible, but it's entirely possible sometimes that we're working on something, another desk is working on something, we haven't kind of talked, and sort of you can end up sort of replicating content. So that is something we're definitely thinking a lot about at the moment, sort of streamlining things. And then I guess a big thing that I would say for anyone who is in a journalistic organisation that is thinking about going into podcasting, as part of the success is so much about getting your colleagues on board. And so I think it's really about thinking about what you can do well, what is your kind of USP in this increasingly crowded market, and then how can you kind of work well with your colleagues, and not just assuming that everyone will be good at audio as well. And also another thing to say, sorry, this is slightly off topic, but while I have it in my head, the importance of doing pilots. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but for me, it's such a fundamental and critical part of making shows. You have to try things out, fail, work out what's not working, and do kind of numerous iterations before you even kind of get to the publishing point.
I just want to add one thing quickly onto what Nicole said about when and how podcast content can come to life in other formats. It's something that's so crucial about that, and also about colleagues finding efficient ways to work together. You know, there's tons of amazing, we do a lot of newsmaker interviews on many of our podcasts. They're hour-long discussions with newsmakers, from CEOs of companies to politicians. And some of the best stuff, you know, can get buried in minute 47 of the podcast. And one thing that we've gotten a lot better at is, so New York Magazine, for instance, has a number of newsletters. One is a daily, end-of-the-day newsletter. And often just some of the last few items in the newsletter will be, oh, Kara Swisher talked to so-and-so, and headline, you know, like whatever the newsmaking headline is, and that clicks through to the podcast transcript. But that requires a lot of coordination, because presumably the newsletter writer isn't sitting around, you know, at the end of the day listening to all of the brand's podcasts, and so somebody's got to flag it. But the podcast producer isn't always thinking about promoting the podcast via their newsroom's other formats, because of course they're thinking about producing their show. So only through like very tight coordination and systematizing has that started to become a regular habit. And even still, you know, at many of our brands, like this is just one brand, Today Explained, again, has this newsletter relationship. And I think they are still establishing the systems that are going to work best for them, because again, these are two separate teams. So it could be the case that they go through the whole day and they're kind of, you know, working on their separate tracks, and the twain does not meet. And so I think it's just really important to articulate and learn from colleagues in past projects that have or haven't worked, to determine how that integration is going to happen, who's responsible, and also, as we were all talking about yesterday, to have really good systems for evaluating. You know, you do an experiment, and then at what point are you drawing the line and saying, okay, we're going to assess, it's been long enough, this many people have spent their time on it, what are the success metrics that we're looking at, how do we know it's working, what's the effort that's going into this collaboration, or this kind of strengthening of content for subscribers, and are we going to keep doing it, and why? And you know, it sounds basic, but I think I've been through this process so many times where we are reinventing the process over and over again with each new show, and that's sometimes necessary because every show's format, audience, application is different, but it is a very important process.
Can I add one really quick thing as well? As much as sort of internal kind of promotion is so important, like newsletters, I also think like platforms are absolutely like crucial for us. 98% of our listens happen off-site, obviously not on the Guardian website, through Apple, Spotify, Pocket Cast. And so really sort of making sure that we have good relationships with those companies has been like absolutely critical for us.
So we've got a few minutes left. We want to leave some time for questions. I believe our organizers have a mic floating around. If I see, they're getting one. Yep, it's there. Why don't we start, she's there, so why don't we start here, right there. If we can bring the mic to there, please.
Hi there, Sarah Topra from Headliner. Thank you, Nicole. That was a really good segue into what I wanted to ask, is really where are people listening? Famously, podcasts have happened sort of elsewhere, off-platform, and publisher CMSs are not super optimized for audio engagement. So I want to know kind of what's your current audience split between on and off platform podcast listening, and what is your ideal audience split kind of in a perfect world?
So, yeah, as I said, like 98% of our listens happen off platform. It's still majority Apple, though I will say it really depends show to show. So today in Focus is definitely got a kind of larger Apple audience. Apple really important to us, but sort of other shows, say for example Weekend, which is like a sort of collation of like some of the best articles of the week read out by actors, that has this huge Spotify audience, very young, female, and sort of much smaller Apple audience. So it really, really does vary. Something we aren't doing, but that I'm kind of watching with interest, is we haven't developed our own audio app, but obviously the New York Times have done that, Tortoise in the UK have done that. I think it's really interesting. Obviously, it's expensive. I think you need to have a lot of premium content, constantly be sort of refilling it, and also like amazing developers to fix the constant app issues. But I think the upside is that once you get people onto your app, you really kind of have probably a pretty sort of engaged audience there, and you get to know a lot more about your audience, and that's really valuable.
Most of our listening happens on the podcast apps. So, and that's, you know, we have a verticalized business, so we produce, distribute, and we sell our own shows. So the revenue comes directly to us, and also there's lots of room in the podcast for the hosts to promote our editorial brands and direct audiences to other things on the site if they want to, but the majority of listening, very little listening happens via our websites.
Other questions? Why don't we come into the front right here, please? Oh, sorry, actually you're already there. How about that one?
Hi, Nishat, and everybody else. This has been such a great session. My name is Fatu Oguche, and I run Big Tech This Week, which is the media company that covers African tech. I'm a big fan of the Vox Media Network. My favorite show is Pivot with Prof. G and Kara. And I've heard you talk a lot about just creating podcast networks, right? And I see that from, maybe I would say competitors for you, like iHeartRadio and all of these people. And I see that, you know, the industry is evolving. I'm very curious about what you think about the future of these podcast networks that you're already creating and building on. Like, is this similar to how radio stations have syndications across like multiple geographies? I really want to know what your vision is when you create these podcast networks, and what does success look like for Vox, or even for you and, you know, the work that you're doing in like 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
So we, thank you for the question. I love talking about this. And, you know, when we, as I mentioned, when we started out, we were mostly working with our kind of homegrown shows that emerged from our editorial brands and our journalists inside the company. And then we pretty quickly started to both create shows. So we would be the producer and developer of shows with folks that would come through us who were sort of friends of the network or affiliated with our brands. And then that expanded to full-on partnerships with third parties, you know, people who already had shows or who came to us to develop shows. We do that a lot, that latter part a lot less now. We are focused on partnering with existing large shows if they're coming from outside the company. So, you know, we have basically the vision, I think, is both to remain one of the top networks that is working to reach scaled audiences in every category that we can, and to become an essential part of people's lives as the podcast landscape overall grows, and to maintain that sort of high quality, so premium shows that people can really trust, and can learn about other credible and enjoyable shows through the shows on our network. And then in terms of podcast networks more generally, I would say, I mean, one thing maybe to mention for other smaller newsrooms that may not have a network, but I do think it has a lot of promise for newsrooms that are interested in going into podcasting is if you're going to start podcasts from within your newsroom, obviously you want to devote serious time, attention, and consideration to it. And I believe that podcasting doesn't work as like a side hobby. Our business has grown because we really, people, for the most part, as I mentioned, our editors started to do it in their spare time, and pretty soon, like, it took over the majority of the time of those people who were podcasting. And we still have editors who do both, are the editors-in-chief, but they also have a show, and I don't know how many hours a week they work. But it's important to us that people who are podcasting with us are devoted to it, and it's taking up a big part of their week. They are passionate about podcasting. They understand the care and the time that it takes. But for newsrooms that do want to experiment, I think one thing that we've done is, as I mentioned, partner with outside podcasters. And I do think there is potential for local newsrooms to be curators. And so is there somebody in your community that maybe you don't have like a food vertical inside your newsroom, or maybe you don't do lifestyle coverage, you do a lot of hard news. But you have these people, local bloggers, local experts, that you feel have synergy and might represent your brand well. The audience already trusts you, so to bring somebody into that network, to bring somebody into your brand as a partner, yes, it is a way to start to develop a network inside your own newsroom, or to think of your own newsroom as potentially being a curator, and that, I would say, is something that other brands could be looking at, even if they don't have ambitions to start a network themselves.
We have time for one more question. I believe there was an eager one in front right here, so please do.
Hello. We see that the podcast market has been extremely professionalized in the last years, and there are still podcasts out there that are independent and don't have a big media outlet in their back, but they have like a niche, extremely interesting topic. So I wonder, what does it need for you to collaborate with these kinds of podcasts that are not that popular, but bring a topic to the table that is interesting for your audience?
We have this a lot, actually. We've started, if I were you and if you had an independent podcast that you really wanted to get out there, and you do, I would really know what you're pitching to any one organization, but I would also sort of start small. I think you could pitch to be a guest on another show. We've done this across our podcast. You could say, you email a news organization or the head of audio at that department and say, I reach this many people. Can we do a cross promo? Can we do a guest swap? I would just sort of start small. It's really about distribution, right, and getting the word out there about your podcast. So I would try for news organizations or any organization or any network, ask to be a guest, or just simply to do a cross promo. Run a 30-second ad for their podcast on your podcast and just swap that.
Thank you so much to our excellent panelists, to the organizers, and especially the volunteers working very hard behind the scenes to make this all work. And thank you all for your interest and your great questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.